for more on Trump's firing of FBI Director Comey and what it means for the U.S. politics joining in Beijing. Harvey Dzodin, who is a former legal counsel and political appointee of President Jimmy Carter, joining us here. Thank you. In Washington, D.C., Rubin, former Deputy Secretary of State from the U.S. Also in Washington, Bruce Fein, constitutional lawyer and author. Welcome to our program. Gentlemen, a lot to talk about. I want you to be concise and precise. First of all, may I ask you, Mr. Rubin, how should we understand the reasoning behind President Trump's firing of James Comey, the FBI director?
The reasoning is unclear, the reasoning is inconsistent, and the White House has not laid out a case that stands the laugh test, as we say in Washington. And the logic demonstrates that the rationale of losing confidence in Director Comey for bungled investigation into Hillary Clinton's emails, that's something that President Trump ran on and was happy about the way Director Comey handled that email controversy. So one has to suspect that it was about shutting down the Russia investigation that the FBI is conducting.
All right.
And it's clear that that is not going to dissipate these questions and these doubts about the real reason.
Mr. Fein, do you have that kind of suspicion, as Mr. Rubin just mentioned?
Yeah, I think the explanation on its face was incredible, but the president under a statute doesn't need an explanation when he fires somebody within the executive branch. The Supreme Court's made it clear since a decision almost a century ago, Myers versus the United States, that the president has virtually limitless authority to discharge executive officials under his team, and he didn't appoint Mr. Comey. I would say this, however, based upon the precedent in Watergate, Congress probably could prohibit a new FBI director from being fired without just cause. For example, Mr. Cox operated under a charter that forbade his discharge absent extraordinary improprieties. And when he was ultimately fired by Richard Nixon, a court held that was illegal because he hadn't done any extraordinary improprieties. Right. But that would require a statute passed by the House and the Senate and signed by the president.
All right, probably that take a lot of time, but what we are talking about right now, Mr. Dzodin, is that the former FBI director, now we should say, Mr. Comey, was being asked already by the Senate Intelligence Committee to testify in front of it next week. The question is, even as a former FBI director, what are the limits of facts that he can say, whether it's a closed or open session for the Congress?
Well, whether it's open or closed is a big variable. So
makes a big difference, of course.
In an open session, cannot say very much. May speak to certain facts.
Let's just say closed.
And closed, I think he can say a lot more, because the closed sessions are designed to prevent information from getting out. However, leaks do happen. And I think that Bruce Fein mentioned about the Watergate, which is relevant here. And you have to remember, in the Watergate, one of the principal reasons for so much information leaking out was the source called Deep Throat, and Deep Throat was a senior FBI official who briefed Woodward and Bernstein, who are the people the journalists who really made Watergate take on a life of its own.
But what are you saying here?
And I would add,
Mr. Dzodin, what are you saying here? Are you saying whether firing or not firing Mr. Comey, there are going to be leaks anyway, right?
I think there'll be leaks anyway, but I think that because President Trump has declared war on the intelligence community, first foreign, now or international, and now domestic, that the knives will be out. The intelligence communities are very strong in America, and they're not going to take this kind of action
But it
sitting
really
down.
depends on who the next FBI director would be at this point. Mr. Giuliani and Mr. Chris Christie, Mr. Rubin, I'm sure they are not your favorites from Democrats' perspective.
Well, I think that if the president's going to stick to the letter of what he announced in his firing of Jim Comey to restore the confidence of the American people in the FBI, which I don't think was lacking anyways, which I found that to be a very strange argument. There have not been calls for the FBI, broadly speaking, to do a better job at protecting Americans. That said, if he's going to restore confidence, he can't put in someone who is perceived to be a tight political ally who will shut down an internal investigation. He needs to put in someone who's seen as nonpartisan. That individual will go before Congress, before the Senate. They will have to get confirmed. They will have to answer tough questions. And that's going to be a very clear test about what kind of support the president does have in the Senate in particular for what he's doing.
Mr. Fein, your expertise here, what extent will a FBI director make a difference in terms of the depth and the limits of investigation against the president?
Well, enormous difference. The FBI director and a prosecutor independent decides questions of who to give immunity to if you want to go higher up on the food chain. You know, when classified information should be declassified in order to prosecute a case, which is rife in this particular instance when you're talking about contacts with foreign governments. You know, the element of prosecutorial discretion is huge, as we witnessed when Mr. Comey was explaining why he decided not to prosecute Hillary Clinton over the emails, even though he said she was extremely careless. Now, one other thing I want to point out, again, going back to Watergate, it is not required under the Constitution that the president appoint the FBI director. Congress could assign a 3-judge court, as they did after Watergate, and make the FBI director appointed by 3 judges, and that way it would ensure at least the appearance of neutrality, as opposed to a situation when you have the target of the investigation appointing somebody who's supposed to investigate him, which is an impossible conflict.
That is going to be quite a situation, what you have just suggested, Mr. Fein. But, you know, all of you have been trying to compare, to a certain extent, what is going on right now with Watergate. Is it appropriate? Have we reached to that stage? Don't forget, gentlemen, that it takes years for Watergate eventually to reach to where it was, Mr. Rubin.
Well, I think that that's the closest contextual comparison that we have, but it really is not an identical analogy. What happened in Watergate, the break-in of the Democratic National Committee by the Nixon associates, that is distinct from the potential of an American political campaign colluding with a hostile foreign power, in this case Russia, to subvert the American presidential elections. And it's critical that we understand what happened, because there will be more American elections. There are new elections in Europe happening. We just had one recently in France, where Russia apparently hacked into one of the candidates, the winning candidates' email servers. So we need, from a national security perspective, to take this seriously. And this is where the FBI plays a central role in protecting the American electoral process, in addition to many other tasks such as counterterrorism, domestic law enforcement. Messing around with the balance that we have in our national security community can be very dangerous, and if we don't fix the problems of that election in 2016 and the cyber attacks that we sustained, it will be damaging to our national security.
But Mr. Rubin, we don't want to forget that today, I mean, just hours ago when Mr. Lavrov, who is the foreign minister of Russia, visited Washington, he met with President Trump, and he was being asked by reporters about what, you know, how to respond to the firing of Comey. He seemed to suggest, together with his president back in Russia, we have really nothing to do with this. So is it, my question really is, Mr. Dzodin, if I could ask you here.
Not very credible.
How much really is this, you know, internal political fights in Washington now spilling over to U.S. decision-making process about its international relations, Mr. Dzodin?
Well, I think that Washington, looking at it from far away, Washington is in complete disarray. And it's been in disarray for more than 112 days, the length of the current administration. Why is it in disarray? Because the president has a unique personality, has a unique management or unmanagement style, because he's failed to name most of the top-level people in his administration to give him advice on crucial issues. And this is a very serious problem. Of course, there's always going to be politics. But the problem here is that the politics, if we go back to Watergate, was much more congenial than it is today. Washington is at war with itself, and now it's even more at war with itself as a result of this move by the president.
Okay, we don't want to forget, Mr. Dzodin, you work for Jimmy Carter. You're a Democrat, so should we take what you have just said 100%, Mr. Fein, even though there is the fact that President Trump's approval rating has been dropping even as we are talking right now. But what would all of this mean for the current administration to make decisions both domestic and also internationally? That really it is what matters to us.
Well, it does, but the American people too. I think the most analogous element to Watergate is the corruption of the process where the rule of law is king and the king is not law, the process whereby everyone should be above suspicion when they're investigating these very, very serious crimes. And that's exactly what the problem of Watergate was. Putting aside all the substance of what was they investigating, a burglary, a cover-up of the burglary, which I would agree is far less serious to our national security than foreign interference with our elections. But if we're going to have a system that retains its purity as the rule of law, we can't have people who have these flagrant conflicts of interest deciding whether you'll be investigated. For instance, in the letter of discharge, Mr. Trump says that Mr. Comey told him 3 times he's not a target of the investigation.
Right.
Well, the FBI doesn't tell presidents whether you're a target. They don't tell anybody if you're a target of the investigation because it alerts them of a means of evasion. And that's why I think this analogy to Watergate is so important, because it is the process and the integrity of our institution. You lose confidence in the government, all of our foreign policy is going to be very fragile.
Mr. Rubin, I want to come back to you. I mean, this is not the first time when the FBI director was being fired. Last time it was during a Democrat administration, was during President Clinton. Of course, there have been enormous amount of accusations against President Clinton from then, the FBI director, and then the investigations about him. But, how should we understand now what is going on in Washington will have a spillover effect on its ability of policy making regarding international relations, particularly U.S.-Russia relations, and also what President Trump promised to the other foreign governments in terms of what the long-term relationship could be.
That's the accurate and appropriate question. There's a bigger picture here at play, and beyond the day-to-day arguments that we're getting into, which are essential arguments. The bigger picture is right now, and the senior advisor to the president, Steve Bannon, verbalized this at a conference a couple of months ago. It's the deconstruction of the administrative state. And so we see the White House has been, for the past several months, firing senior career officials at the Justice Department, at the State Department, publicly condemning the intelligence community, now firing the head of the FBI. This creates deep uncertainty within our national security community, our diplomatic corps, our intelligence professionals. Who knows about the military in terms of how they're feeling? Certainly, they're getting involved in engagements quite actively now in the Middle East in particular. And it's going to make it difficult for this president to advance his foreign policy and for foreign governments to have confidence in what the United States is saying when we have so much tumult, so many firings, so much conflict between the White House and the agencies charged with executing the policy. And that's my big concern about our stability in these relationships.
You could have your concern, but some are arguing, well, the president just have a very different style. What he's doing right now is not illegal, it's low legal, and therefore why you cannot let him just do what he does, Mr. Fein?
But the key thing here is the American word must have strength and confidence.
I see, Mr. Fein. Now.
Yes, I was going to say that if we look at history, the real fright that I have, taking from Nixon putting us on the highest level of security during his impeachment turmoil during the Yom Kippur War, and then Bill Clinton, at the time of his impeachment, he's sending rockets into Sudan and to Afghanistan. If the president becomes under assault domestically, he's likely to resort to some kind of foreign adventurism to distract attention. I say we've seen that twice in my lifetime. And so you may find bombs in North Korea, in Pyongyang, in the middle of a disclosure, leaks or whatever, that embarrass President Trump to take it off the front page. That, in my judgment, is frightening. And that is exactly what we confronted. I remember in the height of Watergate, we were on high-level alert with the Soviet Union. I think it was called DEF 4 or whatever.
I remember
because
that.
of the Yom Kippur War, and President Nixon wanted to get everyone elsewhere.
I remember that. That's going to be extremely dangerous. The final words from you, Mr. Dzodin. We only got 20 seconds left.
Well, if you look back to the Watergate period, the This is a very serious situation that we're dealing with, and for China, it's also serious. Trump and China relations were doing very, very well, in my opinion, but now it's been derailed by this decision, and why Trump did it at this time is just amazing, and I don't know why he did it.
I don't know whether it's being derailed as serious as that, as you just mentioned, but certainly there are a lot of uncertainties going on right now in Washington, which probably could help all of us in the rest of the world get to know more about the politics in your country. Well, I want to thank the three of you gentlemen for being with us. Harvey Dzodin, Rubin, Bruce Fein, really appreciate it. Thank you so much.